we'll end now just with a few words about the school of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. I think what I'll do here is simply mention some of the readings that are available. First of all, as I noted in other classes, the Encyclopedia of Islam is a really valuable resource. And you can get it now on CD. I've had the CD of the Encyclopedia of Islam for the last 6 years, even before it was completed. Then they would renew it until the time that they actually completed it, which was about 2 years ago. And the Encyclopedia of Islam is extremely useful for 1,000 things. Let's say, for example, that you wanted to know about the Hausa language, and you wanted to know about things like how the Hausa used their language to incorporate the culture of West Africa into poems and songs and things like that. You can begin in the Encyclopedia of Islam. You want to know about the Muslims of China, or you want to know about the Maturidis, or you'd like to begin readings because they have bibliography. It's extremely useful. It's an extremely excellent resource. It's a good place to begin. And Ibn Abdul Wahhab, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, is an entry in the encyclopedia, which is a very good place to begin if you're interested in studying his movement. His movement is an 18th century movement, and it's part of the general reform movements of the 18th century that are really important in Islamic history because they affect the great 19th century reform movements that then feed into the 20th century movements, all of them being different, but all of them very important. And the 18th century is really that critical, pivotal century when Muslims have now become something else. When Muslims now are aware of the fact that they are no longer a world civilization, that they are no longer a dominant people, that they are a people that is rapidly losing ground, and that there is another force in the world, the West, especially the Europeans, the colonial Europeans, who are gradually taking everything and only leaving what they don't want. So the 18th century is a time of great crisis. And the Wahhabi movement is one of the responses to that crisis. One of the other Sunni responses to that crisis is Shah Waliullah of Delhi. Shah Waliullah of Delhi is one of the really brilliant respondents to the 18th century crisis. And there are some similarities, but there are also great differences. Sheikh Othman Danfodio of West Africa and his movement is another example of a late 18th century and early 19th century response. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab should be studied in the context of those 18th century reform movements. And in that regard, I recommend the book by Levtsian and Vol, 18th Century Renewal and Reform in Islam. That this is a very good book, very beneficial. And this will give you a context in which to put Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. One of the things that's interesting about him is the fact that his is a reform movement which, like Shah Waliullah, and like the Shia also of the same time, is fundamentally concerned with the differences of opinion and sects that seem to have torn the Muslims apart. Many of the reformers, when they would consider the weakness of Muslims, they would say that, we are so different, we're so dispersed, we're so diverse, we're so dispersed, and we need to come back together. We need to be unified. This is a fundamental concern of Shah Waliullah. And it's also a fundamental concern of Ibn Abdul Wahhab. And therefore his ijtihad is similar in many ways to the kind of ijtihad we talked about earlier tonight, when we spoke about a type of ijtihad that is not really so much concerned with problems and solutions as it's concerned with trying to unify opinions. Like, let's all pray the same way, okay? Let's all make wudu the same way, which is really impossible. That's never going to happen because the methodological differences that are there in the schools are always going to be there. It's always going to be like, well, how do you evaluate the unique hadith? And I can't accept that because to me, there are other sources that are more authoritative. So that's not going to, but in the Wahhabi movement, you have a very literalist approach to that. that let's just follow the hadith, as if the hadith didn't have complexities. And in the Shia at the same time, you have the revival of the Akhbari movement, which is a movement that follows akhbar. It follows reports. Except that in the case of the Twelver Shia, the reports that they're talking about are not exactly the same reports we're talking about. They're talking about hadith that they transmit from the Prophet through their transmitters, which are often the same as our hadith, sometimes different, but generally speaking, there's a lot of overlap. And then they're talking about the reports of the imams. So we have the statements of Fatima, who's not an imam, but she's an authoritative source. And then you have Imam Ali, Imam Hassan, Imam al-Hussein, and the different imams of the line. And those are called akhbar. They're not hadith, but they are akhbar and they're authoritative. So in the case of the Imami Shia, you also have this Akhbari school, which is really strong in the 18th century, and again, that is fundamentally concerned with the same kind of thing the Wahhabis were concerned with, which was trying to remove all these different opinions that people have, and trying to unify the Shia around a particular core of doctrine and of legal practice. And in that case, the Akhbari were opposed to the Mujtahidun, or the Usulis, as they're called. The Usulis were the Shia who believe in Usul al-Fiqh and who believe in ijtihad that goes back to living mujtahids. That has a very interesting tradition among the Shia. So you have this strong conflict in the 18th century, and you have a similar conflict among the Wahhabis, because the original Wahhabis are not even Hanbalis. Even though they come out of the Hanbali school, they in fact reject all schools. And they want people to do ijtihad on the basis of an essentially very literalist understanding of the Quran and the Hadith. Now, the Wahhabi movement was extremely controversial, and it remains that way till this day. And among Sunnis, it was regarded generally as heretical, and among Shia, it was definitely regarded as heretical because of the fact that the Wahhabis pitted themselves against the majority Sunni community and also the Shia community. And although they never did jihad against a non-Muslim power, in fact, they allied from a very early period with the British and then with the Americans. They did fight against Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims, and they often carried out massacres, and they often did atrocious things, absolutely atrocious things. So this pitted the majority of the Sunni community against them because of these atrocities, and also because of the innovations in Wahhabi teaching, which from a traditional Sunni point of view, were innovative, especially in the area of doctrine. So I think that what's very good here is to begin by looking at two very different points of view. One of those would be Hamid Algar and his book Wahhabism. This is a good little book. You can read it in an evening. And Hamid Algar is very clear that he is an enemy of Wahhabism. He takes the traditional Sunni and Shia approach to the Wahhabis. He is nevertheless a historian, and one of the things that's good about Algar is the fact that he draws on all the historical sources. So he looks at Sunni sources, and he looks at Wahhabi sources, and he looks at Western travel accounts, and so forth. The picture is not a very bright picture in this book. Then you have another book by Natana DeLong Bass, Wahhabi Islam, which came out not too long ago. She was a student at Georgetown, and this tends to paint a very positive picture of the Wahhabis. I don't think it should have been accepted as a doctoral thesis. First of all, her knowledge of Arabic is very limited. She makes huge mistakes. And methodologically, she admits to the fact that the Wahhabi movement was very controversial, but she relies almost exclusively on Wahhabi historical sources. So she doesn't take from the other Sunni sources, Ottoman or non-Ottoman, and she doesn't take from travel accounts. She simply regards that material as too problematic to deal with, and a historian can't do that. All the material is problematic. And it all has to be weighed and sifted until we can try to find the real account. But nevertheless, she attempts to be fair. And there are a lot of statements that are fair and are just that are probably quite valid. One of the things that's good about her book is the fact that she shows that there was a very big difference between Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and his immediate family and what they taught and preached, and between the followers who often were very ignorant Bedouins and who often took his teaching to extremes and who are often directly guilty for the great atrocities of the Wahhabi movement. So that kind of a division, that kind of a dichotomy in the Wahhabi movement is something that some of the great Sunnis who were essentially contemporary, like the great Sheikh Ahmed ibn Idris, who was a Moroccan and a Sufi sheikh and also a legal teacher of the law, who was the sheikh of Imam as-Sunusi, who actually witnessed the Wahhabis and lived in Mecca when the Wahhabis took first possession of Mecca. One of the things that he acknowledged is that there is a fundamental difference between the rank and file Bedouin followers of the Wahhabis who had a very simplistic understanding of the Wahhabi teaching, probably like a lot of Wahhabis today, and between the family of Ibn Abdul Wahhab themselves, who he said were scholars, who were people who understood what it meant to prove something or to disprove it, and if you gave them a legitimate argument, they would follow it.
What are the primary differences between Hanbali theology and Hanafi Maturidī theology?
Well, again, Hanbali theology as such is not a monolithic thing. And a lot of Hanbalis have written tracts to say that Ahmad ibn Hanbal is no different from any of the other early Salaf figures. And the key issue here is the issue of anthropomorphism. I mean, that's one of the key issues. And the old Salafi position was not to interpret. So when you are faced with a verse of the Quran or a hadith that speaks of God in human terms or in bodily terms, that will say, for example, that God sat on his throne, or the most merciful, Ar-Rahmanu ala al-Arsh istawa, the most merciful assumed the throne. He took the throne. Or a verse that refers to the hands of the most merciful, or the eyes of the most merciful, or a hadith that refers to God coming down to the seventh heaven in the last part of the night, or talking about the Jabbar, the compeller, putting his foot in hell. And there are many, many hadith like that. There are many verses like that that are essentially anthropomorphic. And these are called mutashabihat. The Quran says that God revealed the book, that it had minhu ayatun muhkamat. Some of the verses in it are of definitive meaning. Hunna ummul kitab. They are the basis of the book. They are the foundation of the book. In other words, that's what you depend on. You reason on the basis. وَأُخَرُ مُتَشَابِهَاتٍ. And there are others that have ambiguities, like the most merciful to assume the throne. So then it says that the people who seek division and so forth, they follow the mutashabihat. And the other ones follow the muhkamat. That's what those verses are about. Now, in the case of these anthropomorphic verses, the Salaf would not interpret them, not one way or the other. They would say that this is what God has said, this is true, we believe in it, and it has a meaning that is appropriate for the Creator who is unlike His creation. So whatever it means, it's not anthropomorphic. They were not anthropomorphists. One of the problems with a lot of the Hanbalis that were regarded to be anthropomorphic, and some of them were, was that they began to take this literally, that God actually has a hand, He actually has an eye. And especially among the modern Salafis and the modern Wahhabis, even though it's very hard to hold them down to this, especially their scholars, but in the way they talk to the public and in their attacks upon rationalist theology, they're really taking anthropomorphic positions. And they will speak about these things in bodily terms. I've heard that many times. I've heard some of the great sheikhs of the Wahhabi movement in Saudi Arabia say things about God's in heaven, He's not in earth, which is absurd. And of course, it's against the Quran because it says that He's Allah in the heavens and the earth. And then the reasoning that this sheikh gave was that if God were in the earth, He'd also be in the toilets, which is idiocy. Because again, in basic rationalist theology, it's very clear that nothing that pertains to temporal beings can pertain to God. So He's not connected to anything, and He's not disconnected to anything. And He's not physically near to anything, and He's not physically far away. He's not transcendent, and He's not immanent in a physical sense, because He's totally other. He's not created. He's not in time and space. He's the Lord of time and space. He's the Lord of the past, the present, and the future. He's not waiting for the future to happen to know what's going to be. God is utterly different than you and I. So, this anthropomorphic wing in the Hanbalis and in then the others that come from them, like the Wahhabis and the Salafis, this is one of the biggest issues. There are also other issues. But among the Salaf, the early generation, anything that was anthropomorphic or mutashabih, they would just leave as it was. And then, as time went by, which wasn't very much time, you have the rationalist theologians who come in the wake of the Mu'tazila. And this is, of course, in the 3rd, the 9th century. And they are compelled to interpret. And they do that. And they themselves will say, the Salaf were safer and we are more knowledgeable. They don't mean it in the way it comes out in English, but they would say, as-Salaf, they would say the way of the Salaf is Aslam and the way of the Khalaf is A'lam. It has more knowledge in it. What they mean to say is that if you don't interpret, you're safer with God because you're not likely to make a mistake. But if you do interpret correctly, there's more knowledge in that, and that knowledge is very important so that people don't misunderstand. So they lived in a time when real anthropomorphism had appeared, and also when total rejection of anthropomorphism had appeared to the extent that maybe it even denied attributes. So then they would take positions where they would interpret, and Abu Hanifa is a master of the old Salafi way, but he opens the door to the new. And they would say, for example, that the hearts of the servant are between the 2 fingers of the most merciful. He turns it over however he wills. And they would say that is will and power, for example. And then you have the great Sufis who will also come into the picture and who will say that the anthropomorphic references to God cannot be understood rationally. But they do belong to the world of imagination. And they do belong to the realm of images and symbols and emblems and signs and the theomorphic nature of reality. And they are the highest mode of intelligence. And they are the very mode of prophetic understanding. So that's why you have it. Because again, if you take a strictly rationalist Ash'ari or Mu'tazili approach, it's like, why does the Quran have these verses? Or why do the Hadith have them? Because like if they've got to be interpreted, then maybe there's a mistake that was made here. And what the great Sufis will say is that the rationalists are correct. None of this can be understood rationally. God, laysa kamithlihi shay', wa huwa as-sami'ul 'alim. That God, God is not like anything. Okay, He's utterly different from everything. So rationally, you have to believe that. But there are other levels of perception. The world of imagination, of images, of dreams, of the whole reality that human beings have, which is actually the complete picture. And there, these are the most meaningful statements of all. And thank you very much. What was the purpose of this? Because was it to create difficulty and hardship? No. And in fact, there's this beautiful hadith in Muslim, where Imam Ibn Abbas is teaching, and Maghrib comes in, and he doesn't stop. And one of the Najdis, they get in the hadith, the Najdis comes up and he says, As-salat, as-salat. This is in Muslim. As-salat. He said, it's time to pray. And Ibn Abbas said, you teaching me the Prophet's religion?
He said, sit down. And then he said, and then the hadith says, لا يجعلن أحدكم للشيطان من نفسه جزءا. Is that how it goes? لا يجعلن. Yeah, but it's the same story. Yeah. So that the hadith starts that way. Ibn Abbas said, don't let any of you make Satan part of yourself. And that's what it's about, because this man who says, no, we have to pray right now, he said that's a person who Satan is part of him, because the Prophet often joined Dhuhr and Asr, and he often joined Maghrib and Isha. And that's what Ibn Abbas was showing him, was that in this case you can do that. Now, we're not going to go into that particular ruling, but the thing is that when you become hard and fast, then it's like something comes in there that didn't really belong.